The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and it told Teresa Rourke in 12 cold words that everything she had built her life upon was gone. She stood in the doorway of the post office in Abilene, Kansas, holding the small folded paper between her fingers, reading it 3 times as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving. They did not. The message was from a lawyer in St. Louis named Hargrove, informing her that her husband, Daniel Rourke, had died of fever 4 weeks prior, that the debts he had accumulated over the last 2 years of their marriage far exceeded the value of their property, and that she had 30 days to vacate the house on Merchant Street before the bank claimed it entirely. Teresa folded the telegram with the kind of careful precision that people employ when they are trying very hard not to fall apart in public. She tucked it into the pocket of her gray cotton dress, thanked the postmaster with a voice that did not tremble. She was deeply proud of that, and walked back out into the wide Kansas sunlight that fell over the main street of Abilene like something indifferent and golden, and entirely unconcerned with the misfortunes of widows. She was 31 years old. She had married Daniel Rourke at 23, when he was charming and optimistic and full of talk about the mercantile business he was going to build in St. Louis. For 7 years she had kept the books, managed the household, stretched every dollar he made to cover the holes left by every dollar he lost. She had not been unhappy exactly. She had been practical. She had been steady. She had been, as her mother once told her with a kind of resigned admiration, the sort of woman who holds things together with the sheer force of her attention. And now there was nothing left to hold together. She had come to Abilene because her older sister, Margaret, lived there with her husband, Frank, who worked at the cattle yards. It had seemed like the most logical place to land after St. Louis, after the house, after the auction of everything that could be auctioned. Margaret had welcomed her with open arms and a bed in the back room and an endless supply of biscuits, which was Margaret's primary expression of love. But Teresa had been there for 6 weeks now, and she could feel herself becoming a problem that her sister was too kind to name. She sat that evening on the small wooden porch of Margaret's house, watching the last of the daylight leave the sky in long streaks of amber and rose. The prairie stretched out to the west in every direction, flat and enormous and breathing quietly, and Teresa thought that she had never felt more like a person who had absolutely no idea what came next. "You cannot stay here forever," she said aloud, though there was no one on the porch to hear it. She was not speaking to Margaret, she was speaking to herself. She had developed the habit of narrating her own dilemmas in the past weeks, as though the sound of the words might clarify something. "You are not built for starting over," she continued. "You have done this once and it nearly broke you and you cannot do it again." She believed this the way she believed in gravity. It was simply a fact about her nature. Inside the house, Frank was arguing cheerfully with someone through the open window, and Teresa turned her head just slightly to listen. Frank was a broad, red-faced man with a laugh like a cattle bell, and he was always arguing cheerfully with someone. Tonight it appeared to be a man whose voice she did not recognize, low and unhurried, with a quality to it that suggested he was not easily rattled by anything. "I'm telling you, Sheridan," Frank was saying, "that parcel east of the creek is sitting there doing absolutely nothing for you and you know it." The other voice, Sheridan, replied with a kind of dry patience. "It's doing plenty. It's resting." Frank laughed that cattle-bell laugh. "Land doesn't rest, you stubborn man. Land either works or it dies." "Then it's dying peacefully," Sheridan said, "and I'd appreciate you letting it." Teresa did not think much of this conversation. She pulled her shawl tighter and went back to watching the sky darken over the prairie, and she tried very hard to make herself feel something like a plan. When she came inside for supper, the man from the argument was sitting at Margaret's table. He was perhaps 33 or 34, with dark hair that was longer than fashionable, brown from the sun in the particular way of men who spent all their time outdoors. And he had the build of someone who worked a great deal with his hands, not imposing, exactly, but solid and contained in his own skin in a way that Teresa noticed, and then immediately decided not to think about. His eyes were a complicated shade of gray-green, and when Frank introduced him as Nathan Sheridan, a rancher who ran cattle on about 300 acres south of town, those eyes met hers with a directness that was neither rude nor romantic, just attentive. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, and stood from his chair, because whatever else he was, he had clearly been raised with manners. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, and sat down at the table and asked Margaret if she needed any help with the biscuits. Supper was Frank's territory in terms of conversation. He talked about the cattle market, about the railroad expansion, about a dispute between two neighboring ranchers over a water source that had apparently been going on for 3 years with no resolution and no sign of one. Nathan Sheridan listened more than he spoke, contributing occasionally with short, precise observations that tended to cut through Frank's elaborate storytelling and locate the actual point. Teresa found herself watching him do this with something that was almost admiration, though she was careful to keep her expression entirely neutral. Margaret refilled everyone's coffee after dessert and said, in that gentle but determined way she had, "Teresa has been thinking about what to do next. She was telling me this morning that she's been considering taking on work somewhere." Teresa had not said this. She had said she was thinking about it. But she recognized the maneuver for what it was, Margaret trying to be helpful, and so she did not correct her. Nathan Sheridan looked across the table at her with those gray-green eyes. "What kind of work?" "I kept books," Teresa said. "For my husband's business, and I can manage a household, and I can cook well enough not to poison anyone, which I understand is considered a skill in cattle country." Something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "It's considered a rare talent," he agreed. "I'm not looking for charity," she added, because she wanted that to be clear from the beginning. "I'm looking for work." "I know the difference," Nathan Sheridan said simply, and went back to his coffee. Later, after Nathan had gone and Frank had settled into his chair by the fire with a newspaper, Margaret found Teresa in the kitchen washing the supper dishes and leaned in the doorway with that particular look on her face. "He has that parcel," Margaret said. "I heard about the parcel," Teresa said, "east of the creek. He bought it as part of a larger purchase 3 years ago, and he's never done a thing with it. There's a small house on it. Needs work, but it's standing." Teresa kept washing the dishes. "Margaret, I'm just saying, you're not just saying anything. You are suggesting a very specific thing, and I would appreciate you letting me find my own way to it instead of being pushed." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to find your own way to it?" Teresa scrubbed at a pot that was already clean. "I don't know," she admitted. She thought about it for 3 days. She walked through Abilene in those 3 days with careful eyes, looking at what the town was and what it needed, and whether there was any place in it for a 31-year-old widow with good arithmetic and a stubborn disposition. She inquired at the general store, at the school, at the hotel on the main street. The school had a teacher. The hotel had 3 of them. The general store's owner looked at her with a kind of apologetic sympathy and said he was barely keeping himself afloat. On the 4th day she rode out to see the parcel east of the creek. Frank lent her a mare and gave her directions that were more optimistic than precise, but she found the creek by following the sound of water, and she found the parcel by following the line of fence posts that Nathan Sheridan had clearly put in with considerable effort and equal spacing. The house was a single-story structure of raw lumber, small but not desperate, with a porch that leaned slightly to the left and a roof that appeared to have weathered several significant debates with the Kansas wind and emerged from most of them intact. She tied the mare to the fence and walked around the property slowly. The land itself was good. She could see that even without knowing much about land. The soil was dark near the creek bank, and the grass was the kind of thick, deep-rooted prairie grass that suggested the earth beneath it was not exhausted. There was a well, she found it on the south side of the house, the wooden cover weathered but solid. There were the remnants of what might have been a kitchen garden at some point, the bed still outlined by stones someone had placed with intention. She stood there in the spring wind with her hair coming loose from its pins and the sound of the creek behind her, and she thought about what it might be like to work something back to life. Not a marriage, not a business someone else had built and failed, something of her own from the beginning. She was not built for starting over. She had told herself that so many times in the past 6 weeks that it had become a kind of internal weather, constant and unquestioned. She stood there in the wind and she thought, but maybe the land is. She went looking for Nathan Sheridan the following morning. She found him where Frank said she would find him, at his main ranch, which sat about 2 miles southwest of the parcel, a more established spread with a proper barn and a bunkhouse where 2 hired hands lived. He was mending fence when she rode up, his shirt rolled to the elbows, methodical about it in the way he seemed to be methodical about everything. He looked up when he heard the horse and watched her dismount with an expression that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, "I want to talk to you about the parcel east of the creek." He set down the fence tool he was holding. "All right." "I want to rent it," she said. "The land and the house. I will pay you what I can at first, which I acknowledge is not much, but I intend to run a kitchen garden and sell produce and eggs, if I can get chickens started, to the households in town. I am also offering my bookkeeping services to any of the local businesses that need them, and I expect to have proper income within 2 months. I will pay you fairly once I do." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the prairie between them and ruffled the grass. "Why that parcel?" he asked. She had thought about this answer. "Because the soil near the creek is good and I can grow things on it. Because the house is small enough that one person can manage it. Because it is not in town, which means I will not be in anyone's way." "You're not in anyone's way in town." "I am in my sister's way," she said, even though she is too kind to say it, "and I am in my own way, which is worse." Something shifted behind his eyes, not the corner of the mouth suggestion this time, but something quieter and more considered. "It needs work," he said. "The house." "I noticed the porch lists to the left," she agreed. "The roof is passable, but the second window on the east side has lost its seal and lets in rain." "I can manage rain coming in through a window," she said. He was quiet again for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone who was actually thinking rather than someone performing thoughtfulness. "I'll tell you something honestly," he said finally. "I bought that parcel because it was part of a larger deal and I couldn't separate them. I've never had a clear plan for it. Land like that wants to be used." "I intend to use it," Teresa said. "I can see that," he said. He looked out toward the east, in the direction of the creek he couldn't see from here but clearly knew the location of by memory. "I'm not going to charge you rent for the first 3 months. After that, we can settle on a number that's fair." She started to object and he held up one hand. "It's not charity," he said before she could speak. "The land has been sitting idle for 2 years. 3 months of someone working it is worth more to me than 3 months of empty rent from someone who can't afford to pay it yet. It's a practical arrangement." She regarded him for a moment. He returned her gaze with that same level directness, not pushing, not charming, just honest. "All right," she said. 3 months. "And then we settle on a fair number." "Fair enough," he said. He picked up the fence tool again, then paused. "I can fix the porch and seal that window before you move in. Give me a week." "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but a leaning porch is an embarrassment to the person who built it, and I built it, so I'll fix it." She looked at him, this man who was practical about land and honest about his own work and careful about the difference between charity and fairness, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Sheridan." "Nathan," he said, not looking up from the fence. "If we're going to be neighbors, we might as well use names." "Teresa," she said. He nodded once, as if this were a transaction completed, and went back to his fence. She rode back to Margaret's house with the spring wind at her back and something that was not quite hope. She was too careful for hope yet, but was perhaps the early structural elements of it. The week Nathan spent fixing the porch was the beginning of something neither of them acknowledged directly. He came to the parcel on the second and fourth days of that week, and Teresa, who had begun to transfer her belongings there in small loads borrowed from Frank's wagon, found herself working alongside him in a proximity that felt both practical and strangely comfortable. He worked without unnecessary conversation, but he was not silent. He asked relevant questions about what she planned to do with each section of the land, and listened to her answers with genuine attention, occasionally offering observations that were practical and well-considered without ever shading into telling her what to do. On the fourth day, he brought the seal compound for the window and a second set of cedar planks for the porch floor, and Teresa made coffee on the small iron stove she had managed to purchase second-hand from the hardware store in town, and they sat on the newly level porch in the late afternoon and drank it. "You know this territory?" she asked. "Born about 40 miles south," he said. "My father ran a small spread. I started my own when I was 22. How old are you now?" 34. She did the arithmetic. 12 years building something of his own. She respected that without saying so. "You have family nearby?" she asked. "My father passed 3 years ago," he said. "Mother lives in Wichita with my younger sister and her husband. I go when I can, which is not as often as I should." "I know that feeling," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "My mother is in Cincinnati," she explained. "I haven't been back since I married Daniel and went to St. Louis, and now," she stopped. "Well." Now Abilene seemed more practical than Cincinnati. "Does your mother know where you are?" "I wrote her from Margaret's. She wrote back immediately, of course, and said I should come home." She looked out at the prairie. "But home is not, it's not my home anymore. It's hers, my mother's house, and I need something that is yours," Nathan said. She looked at him, a little surprised at the accuracy of it. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He nodded slowly, looking out at the land that spread east from the porch toward the creek glittering in the distance. "That's the thing about land," he said. "It doesn't belong to whoever came before or whoever comes after. It belongs to whoever is working it right now. Right this minute." He paused. "This piece has been waiting for someone to work it." She thought about what he said for the rest of that evening after he had gone, and she thought about it again in the morning when she woke up in the small house that smelled of cedar and new sealant and old prairie dust, and the sun came through the east window, the sealed one, and fell across the wooden floor in a pattern that looked, she thought, almost exactly like the beginning of something. She started the garden in the second week of April. The soil near the creek was everything she had hoped, dark and deep and cooperative. She ordered seeds from the general store in town: beans, squash, carrots, potatoes, onions, and a small section of herbs. She dug the beds herself, turning the soil with a spade until her shoulders ached in a way that was entirely different from the exhausting, endless ache of worry. This was a good ache, a productive one. Nathan came by on a Saturday with a small coop and 4 laying hens in a wooden crate. She came out of the garden with soil on her hands and looked at the crate. "I said I was going to get chickens. These are good layers," he said, setting the crate down carefully. "From Pearson's farm south of here. He had more than he needed." "How much?" "Consider it a neighbor's contribution to the enterprise," he said. She looked at him with that steady gaze she had. "Nathan, they were already paid for before you could argue," he said pleasantly, "so there's no logical basis for the argument." She pressed her lips together to suppress something that wanted to become a smile. "I will replace them with 2 additional chickens once I'm established," she said. "That's more than fair," he agreed. He helped her set up the coop on the south side of the house, driving the support posts into the ground with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. Teresa watched him work and found herself noticing things about him that she had been carefully not noticing. The way he moved with an economy of effort that was somehow graceful, the particular focus of his expression when he was measuring something, the way the afternoon sun caught the dark hair at the back of his neck. She went back to the garden and dug another row of potato hills. He stopped by roughly twice a week through April and into May, always with a purpose. He had spare fencing wire when she needed to reinforce the garden against rabbits. He had a recommendation for a man in town named Chester who did hauling and could bring a load of river sand that would help the soil drainage on the north side of the property. He had once, memorably, appeared with a somewhat confused-looking goat that he claimed had wandered onto his property from some unclear neighboring origin, and which he felt, all things considered, would be more useful to Teresa than to him. "You found this goat," she said, standing in her doorway looking at the animal, which was a medium-sized brown and white creature regarding her with the placid insolence specific to goats. "She appeared," Nathan said. "I asked around. Nobody claims her. She gives decent milk." "Nathan. Her name is apparently Agnes," he added, as if this settled the matter. Agnes the goat moved her jaw in a slow, ruminative circle, surveying Teresa's porch with proprietary interest. "You are a very stubborn man," Teresa said. "I'm a practical man," he said. "There's a difference." She took Agnes because of course she did. The town, meanwhile, had started to know her name. She had begun selling eggs and produce from a small stand on the main street on Thursday and Saturday mornings, arriving before 7 with whatever the garden and the hens had produced that week. The women of Abilene, the practical, capable ones who ran households on tight margins and tight schedules, found in Teresa Rourke a vendor who priced fairly and did not waste their time. She also, quietly and without advertising it, began to keep accounts for two of the local businesses: the hardware store, whose owner Josiah Mendez had been doing his own books with cheerful incompetence for 6 years, and a small dressmaker named Colette Bauer who made beautiful clothes and had a horror of numbers. By the middle of May, she was paying Nathan the agreed rent, which he accepted without ceremony, and she had enough left over to buy herself a proper pair of work gloves and a new length of gingham for a summer dress. She told Margaret all of this on a Sunday visit, sitting on Margaret's familiar porch, and Margaret listened with a face full of carefully maintained neutrality. "And Nathan Sheridan comes by regularly," Margaret said when Teresa had finished. "He is a good neighbor," Teresa said. "He is a very good-looking neighbor," Margaret said. "Margaret, I'm just observing. Your observations have a very specific direction." Margaret smiled into her coffee. "Does he always find reasons to come by?" Teresa thought about this with more honesty than she'd allowed herself until now. The fencing wire, the hauling recommendation, the chickens, the goat. "I think," she said slowly, "that he is a thorough person who addresses problems when he identifies them." "I think," Margaret said, "that he likes you." Teresa looked out at the familiar street. "It doesn't matter," she said. "Of course it matters. I am not in a position to—" She stopped. She tried again. "I am only recently through the worst year of my life. I do not know what I am yet. I am still becoming whatever I am going to be. And he is a rancher who has built his own life over 12 years and has no reason to need anything from someone who is only just learning how to begin again." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, gently, "Maybe that is not what he is looking for. Maybe he is looking for someone worth beginning alongside." Teresa had no answer for that, which was, she thought, itself an answer of some kind. On the last Saturday of May, Nathan arrived at the parcel not with a practical contribution or a useful animal, but simply with himself and a question. He knocked on the door frame of the open front door and found her at the table doing Colette Bauer's accounts, and when she looked up he said, "The river is running high this week from the spring melt. There's a stretch about 3 miles north where the bank is worth seeing. I was going to ride out, if you wanted to come." She looked at him. He stood in her doorway looking neither expectant nor indifferent, just honest, the way he always was, which was the thing about him that she found most disarming. "The accounts need to be finished today," she said. "I'll come back in an hour," he said. She looked back down at the accounts. Then she said, "Give me 30 minutes." They rode north along the creek in the long afternoon light, and the world opened up around them in the way the Kansas prairie does in late spring, enormous and green, and breathing with a kind of ancient ease that made human concerns feel momentarily small and manageable. The river ran high as Nathan had said, the water dark and quick over the limestone bed of the shallows, and where the bank widened there was a stretch of cottonwood trees whose new leaves were the most particular and tender shade of green that Teresa thought she had ever seen. They left the horses on the bank and walked without saying much at first, just the sound of the water and the wind in the cottonwoods, and the occasional call of a meadowlark from somewhere in the grass. "My father used to bring me here," Nathan said eventually, "when I was young. He said the river was the honest part of the land, that everything else could be shaped or managed, but the river just went where it needed to go." Teresa thought about this. "Did you believe him?" "I believe most of what my father told me," he said. "He was a careful man with his words." "That is something you have in common," she said, and then immediately wondered if she should have said it, but he glanced at her sideways with that particular almost smile and didn't seem to mind. "What was your husband like?" he asked, not intrusively, just with the directness he applied to everything. She thought about Daniel. She owed him honesty even now, even in her own accounting of him. "He was kind when things were good," she said. "He was optimistic. He loved talking about possibilities, what the business could become, where we might live someday, what we might do." She paused. "He was less good at the doing part, less good at the arithmetic of reality. And you handled the arithmetic." "I always handled the arithmetic," she said. "I didn't mind. I believed for a long time that my steadiness was what gave his vision room to exist, that we balanced each other." "And then the arithmetic stopped adding up," he said. "Yes." She looked at the water. "And I was angry for a while, after. I was angry that I had kept such careful books and it hadn't been enough. And then he died and the anger had nowhere to go, and I was just—" She made a small, helpless gesture with her hand, empty and very tired. He was quiet beside her for a long moment. "You don't look empty now," he said finally. She turned and looked at him, surprised. "You look like someone who is very busy becoming something," he said. "It reads different than empty." She thought about what Margaret had said, someone worth beginning alongside. "I told myself I wasn't built for starting over," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud to anyone but herself. He nodded slowly. "What do you think now?" She looked at the green cottonwood leaves, the running water, the wide sky over the Kansas prairie that had absolutely no opinion about what she was capable of. "I think," she said carefully, "that I might have been wrong about that." He didn't say anything to this. He didn't need to. They stood by the river in the late afternoon light, and the meadowlark sang from the grass and the water ran quick over the limestone, and it was, Teresa thought, the most peaceable she had felt in longer than she could remember. On the ride back, when the sun had dropped to the horizon and the prairie had turned amber and deep gold around them, Nathan said, "Will you have supper with me on Friday?" "At the house?" She looked at the amber prairie and the quiet road ahead. "Yes," she said, "I will." It was not a simple thing, that supper. It was simple in its components. Nathan cooked a beef roast with onions and potatoes that he had clearly given some thought to, and he had a bottle of wine that he admitted with brief embarrassment had been sitting in his pantry for 2 years waiting for an occasion he hadn't gotten around to manufacturing. The table was set with a care that was visible in its careful awkwardness, the way a man sets a table who does not set tables for guests regularly and is trying his honest best. But sitting across from him in the amber lamplight of his kitchen, with the ranch quiet around them and the prairie night settling outside the windows, Teresa felt the complicated weight of everything that was not being said and everything that was being carefully felt around the edges. She noticed, over the course of that supper, specific things about Nathan Sheridan that she had been cataloging without intending to. The way he laughed rarely, and therefore all the more worth catching, at something she said about Agnes, the goat's opinion of the kitchen garden. The way he listened to her talk about the bookkeeping work she was building with a genuine, focused interest that was entirely without condescension. The way he refilled her wine glass without making a ceremony of it, just quiet attention to what she might need. After supper they sat on his porch in the blue darkness and she looked at his ranch spread out before them, the barn, the fence lines, the south pasture where she could hear cattle moving in the dark, and she thought about what 12 years of focused work looked like, what it felt like to sit inside something you had built with your own hands. "What made you want this?" she asked. "All of this. The ranch." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at his own land. "My father's spread was always someone else's," he said. "He worked it for 30 years and never owned it. When he died, there was nothing to leave. I decided when I was young that I would work until I owned something that could not be taken." He paused. "I suppose that sounds grim." "It sounds true," she said. He turned and looked at her in the darkness, and something in his expression had shifted from the careful, contained steadiness she was used to into something more open, more uncertain, in the particular way that certainty sometimes cracks under the right circumstances. "Teresa," he said, just her name. The way he said it had weight. "Nathan," she said back, equally careful. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it correctly because I have spent some time thinking about how to say it correctly and I am still not sure I have worked it out." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I know you are still finding your footing," he said. "I know that you are building something that is yours and that this is the most important thing happening for you right now, and I respect that entirely. I am not trying to complicate it." He looked away, then back. "But I have found over the past months that the days when you are at the parcel are different from the days when you are not. And I don't think I am being practical about that. I think I am just telling you that you matter to me, in a way that is not neighborly." Teresa looked at him for a long moment in the dark. She had been so careful. She had been so deliberately, systematically careful about not letting anything beyond practicality and fair exchange develop between them. She had categorized every kindness of his as a transaction. She had filed every moment of ease between them under the heading of convenient proximity. She had done this because she was afraid, not of him specifically, but of what it would mean to reach for something again when she had so recently lost everything she had reached for before. "I am afraid," she said honestly. "I want you to know that I am not a person who finds this kind of thing easy." "I know," he said. "I'm not either. You have been very patient. I have been waiting for you to trust this," he said, "which is different from waiting for you." She looked at him. That distinction was exactly the kind of thing that was going to undo all her careful defenses, and she thought she had known it for some weeks. "I am not fully put back together yet," she said. "I'm not asking for fully put back together," he said. "I'm asking for Thursday evening and maybe Saturday afternoon, and whatever you can spare in between." She looked at the dark prairie and the lamplit window of his house, and she thought about the parcel east of the creek, which was hers to borrow, and which she had slowly, stubbornly, terrifyingly begun to love. "Thursday evening," she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended it to be, "would be very welcome." He smiled then, fully, for the first time she had seen, not the corner suggestion but the actual smile, and it changed his whole face into something warmer and more luminous, and Teresa thought with a sudden sharp clarity, "There it is. That is what he looks like when he stops being so careful." She rode home to the parcel under the stars with Agnes asleep in the coop, and the creek running in the dark to the east, and the prairie spread out all around her enormous and indifferent and lovely. She was, she thought, beginning to disagree with herself about what she was built for. June in Kansas was a warm, generous, busy month, and June with Nathan Sheridan in it became something Teresa would remember in specific colors and specific sounds for the rest of her life. Thursday evenings at his ranch. Saturday afternoons that began with practical purposes. She was helping him organize 3 years of accumulated ranch accounts that he had been keeping in a state of cheerful chaos, and extended into long walks along the creek, or into town for supper at the hotel when it was too hot to cook. She learned things about him in that month with the particular attentive pleasure of someone learning a new language. She learned that he had a habit of reading in the mornings before the day began, history primarily, with an occasional novel he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk and did not exactly advertise. She learned that he could be quietly, devastatingly funny in a dry way that surprised her every time it appeared. She learned that he had a deep and abiding respect for the Kanza people, the native inhabitants of this land, who had been displaced from it in a process that Nathan spoke about with a quiet, uncomfortable honesty that surprised her. He said once that the single thing about his ownership of this land that he could not fully make peace with was that it had been obtained through a process that was not right, and that the least he could do was work it responsibly and remember what it cost others for him to have it. Teresa, who had grown up with the comfortable indifference of a St. Louis merchant family, sat with that statement for several days after he made it and found that it shifted something in how she understood the world around her. She also learned slowly that she was not afraid of him, that the thing she had feared, the catastrophic vulnerability of caring again, was not a catastrophe in his company. It was simply present, acknowledged, held steadily between them without drama. She learned this on a Wednesday in the second week of June when she came to the ranch in some distress because one of her laying hens had died of what she suspected was a respiratory illness, and she was worried about the others. And Nathan had looked at the hen, consulted his knowledge of chickens, separated the ones he suspected were showing early signs, and spent 2 patient hours explaining to her the management of flock health in a way that was completely without implication, but included a great deal of casual physical proximity that she did not object to and in fact found. She was honest enough with herself to admit this, quite specifically pleasant. When he left the coop and washed his hands at the pump and turned back to her with the evening light behind him, she said, before she could think better of it, "You are the most genuinely useful person I have ever known." He looked at her with that level gray-green attention. "And very kind," she added, "which you try to hide behind the useful." "I'm practical," he said. "You are kind," she said firmly, "and I am not going to let you argue me out of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She looked up at him. She was slightly shorter, which meant that looking up at him in the evening light was a specific and particular experience, and something in the air between them shifted from the warm, grounded ease they had been building for weeks into something more charged and more immediate. "Teresa," he said in that weighted way. "Yes," she said, not to a question, just yes to whatever was coming. He took her face in both hands, careful, the way he was careful about everything, and kissed her in the evening light beside the chicken coop, with Agnes somewhere in the yard making her considered opinions known about the spring grass. And it was the most quietly extraordinary thing that had happened to Teresa Rourke in longer than she could account for. She put her hands against his chest and felt the solid, real, present weight of him, and kissed him back with every ounce of the honesty she had been accumulating over a lifetime of careful, steady, sometimes lonely practicality. When they separated, she kept her hands where they were and looked at him. "I have been not doing that for approximately 6 weeks, she said. 7, he said. She laughed, actually laughed, surprised out of composure, and he smiled again with that full, luminous smile, and she thought, "There it is again. There you are." July arrived with its full Kansas heat, and with it a development that Teresa had not anticipated. A man named Edward Garrett rode out to the parcel on a Thursday morning in the first week of July, and introduced himself as a land agent from Wichita, who represented a company that was buying up parcels along the creek corridor for a proposed irrigation development. He was a neat, businesslike man in a good coat who spoke in the smooth, confident cadences of someone who was accustomed to making things sound both inevitable and advantageous. He told Teresa that the parcel east of the creek, where she lived, was among those being acquired. She stood in her doorway and listened to him with a face that revealed nothing and asked him, when he was finished, to explain the terms. The terms were that the company would pay Nathan Sheridan a reasonable sum for the parcel, and that Teresa would have 60 days to vacate. She thanked Garrett for his time and told him she had no authority to speak for the owner of the property, and that he would need to speak with Nathan Sheridan. He rode out. She stood on her porch, her level, repaired porch, and looked at the garden that was at the height of its summer productivity, and at the creek glittering through the cottonwoods, and at the land that she had been working and that had been, in every meaningful sense, beginning to feel like hers. She felt the cold, familiar shape of something being taken. She told Nathan that evening. He listened without interrupting, his face doing that careful, still thing it did when he was processing something significant. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him. "It is your land," she said. "The decision is yours." "I know it's my land," he said. "That's not what I asked. I asked what you want." She looked out at the prairie. She knew what she wanted. She had known for some weeks what she wanted actually in ways that went well beyond the question of the parcel. But the parcel was the immediate question, and she answered it honestly. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to keep the garden and the hens and Agnes and the creek and the kitchen I have learned to cook in and the porch I sit on every morning. I want to keep what I have made here." She paused. "But I also want to be clear that I am not going to fall apart if I have to leave. I am not," she stopped, because what she was about to say was the old thing, the thing she had been disproving for months, and she found she did not want to say it anymore. Nathan was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It was not the patient, steady attention she was used to. It was something more open and more certain. "I am not going to sell it," he said. She looked at him. "I am not going to sell it to an irrigation company from Wichita," he said. "I have no interest in doing that, and I never have." He paused. "But I want to talk to you about something else." "All right," she said more cautiously. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was choosing his words with great care. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the fact that you pay me rent for that parcel, and about the fact that the parcel would not be what it is right now without your work on it, and about the fact that I would like—" He stopped, tried again. "I would like for the things that are yours to actually be yours, not borrowed." She went very still. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I am saying," he said, slowly and with a care that made every word feel precisely weighed, "that I think I would like to marry you, Teresa. And I am saying that if you are not ready for that, I entirely understand it and I will wait, because what we have is worth waiting for and I am a patient man." He met her eyes. "But I want you to know that what I am offering is not a piece of land to borrow. What I am offering is everything I have. The ranch and the parcel and the work and the life. Not borrowed. Yours." Teresa's heart was doing something large and ungovernable in her chest. "You said you weren't going to be complicated about the land," she said, because she needed to say something and her voice needed somewhere to go. "I'm not being complicated about the land," he said. "I'm being straightforward about my feelings, which is different." She looked at him in the warm July evening. She thought about what she had told herself in the first terrible weeks after the telegram. She had said she was not built for starting over. She had believed it completely. And then she had come to this piece of land and she had dug into its soil with her own hands, and she had coaxed it into producing things, and she had woken up every morning in the small house on the leaning but now repaired porch, and watched the sun come through the sealed east window and felt, incrementally and stubbornly and terrifyingly, like herself. And she had met Nathan Sheridan, who fixed things that needed fixing and said what he meant and listened when she spoke and kissed her with both hands careful on her face beside the chicken coop and never once, not once treated her like someone who needed rescuing. He had only ever treated her like someone worth beginning alongside. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Yes," she said again, more firmly, because she had decided and she was not a person who unmade her decisions once she had made them. "Yes, Nathan, I will marry you." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her hands, both of them, holding them carefully, looking at her with that luminous, full smile that she was going to spend the rest of her life working to earn. "I need to write to my mother," she said. "I need to tell Frank before he hears it from someone else," he said, "because if Frank Caldwell hears news like this second-hand, he will never forgive me." She laughed, and he laughed, and they stood there on his porch in the July evening, holding each other's hands like people who had found something neither of them had been looking for, and were therefore entirely unprepared for how completely it had changed everything. Edward Garrett returned the following week, as Nathan had anticipated he might. This time he came to the main ranch and found Nathan and Teresa both there. They had taken to spending most evenings at one property or the other, shifting the work and the conversation between both places with an ease that had developed into something like household routine. Garrett, seeing Teresa, addressed his remarks to Nathan with the studied politeness of a man who has decided she is incidental to the transaction. Nathan listened to the revised offer. The irrigation company had increased the sum, which Garrett presented as a gesture of good faith, and then said, with a politeness equally studied, "Mr. Garrett, I appreciate the company's interest. The parcel east of the creek is not for sale at any price I am aware of, and I don't anticipate becoming aware of one. The reason the parcel east of the creek is not for sale is that the woman standing next to me is going to be my wife, and that parcel is her home, and I did not spend 12 years building this ranch to sell pieces of it to a company from Wichita." Garrett looked at Teresa. Teresa looked back at him with a pleasant, absolute expression. Garrett, being a man with sufficient experience to recognize a closed matter, accepted Nathan's refusal with good professional grace and left without pushing it. The irrigation company moved on to other parcels. The creek ran on unmolested. That evening, after Garrett's departure, Teresa stood in the doorway of Nathan's kitchen watching him pour coffee and felt a surge of something so warm and particular that she had to set it down mentally and look at it straight on for a moment. It was love, she supposed. It had been arriving for weeks in small, accumulating increments the way all the best things did, not a lightning strike but a river, building steadily toward a level that eventually overflowed the channel she had built to contain it. "Thank you," she said. He looked up from the coffee. "For what?" "For what you said to him," she said. "For the way you said it." He brought her the coffee and set it on the table and said simply, "It was the truth." She took the coffee and looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm thanking you for it." They wrote to Teresa's mother in Cincinnati and to Nathan's mother in Wichita simultaneously, in letters that Teresa composed with the careful thoroughness she applied to everything, and that Nathan reviewed with some admiration for her clarity. Nathan's mother, Alina, wrote back within 10 days in a letter full of an emotion that she expressed in very contained, precise language that immediately told Teresa where Nathan's particular way with words had come from. Teresa's mother, Rose Callahan, wrote back within a week in a letter that was considerably less contained and approximately 4 times as long, full of joy and concern and questions, and the particular maternal energy of a woman who had spent 2 years worrying about her daughter and was now required to process a sudden, complete reversal of fortune. She said she wanted to come for the wedding. She said she would bring Teresa's grandmother's ring, which was silver with a small turquoise stone that had always been earmarked for Teresa. She said she needed to know everything about this Nathan Sheridan and whether his ranch had a proper roof. Teresa wrote back and told her mother that the ranch had an excellent roof and that Nathan was the most genuinely good person she had met in her entire adult life, and that she would very much like her mother to come. Rose Callahan arrived in Abilene in the first week of September on the afternoon train, a small and energetic woman of 60 with white hair pinned under a traveling hat and the observant eyes of someone who has spent decades reading people accurately. She embraced Teresa on the platform with a ferocity that made Teresa's eyes sting, with a warmth she had not expected. Nathan was there too, holding both their horses with a patient composure that could not entirely hide the fact that he was somewhat nervous, which Teresa found both human and endearing. Rose Callahan stepped back from Teresa, held her daughter at arm's length with both hands, looked at her face with long, careful attention and said, "You look like yourself again." Teresa's throat tightened. "I feel like myself again," she said. Rose turned and looked at Nathan Sheridan. Nathan met her gaze steadily and said, "Mrs. Callahan, it's a genuine honor." Rose looked at him for a long, assessing moment that Nathan bore without flinching. Then she said, Teresa says you're a good man. I try to be, he said. She also says you fixed her porch. It needed fixing, he said. Rose Callahan nodded once, as if this were the most important thing she had been told. Good, she said. A man who fixes things when they need fixing is worth keeping. She took his offered arm and they walked toward the horses, and Teresa followed them into the September afternoon with the feeling, new and strange and deeply right, of the scattered pieces of her life moving steadily toward each other. The wedding took place on the 5th of October, 1882, in the small white church at the edge of Abilene that served the ranching and farming community in the surrounding territory. Margaret and Frank were there, and Frank cried, which no one who knew him was particularly surprised by. Eleanor Sheridan came from Wichita with Nathan's sister Clara and Clara's husband James, a steady, cheerful man who farmed wheat on the flat land north of Wichita. Rose Callahan wore her best gray dress and held Teresa's grandmother's ring in a small velvet box until the moment it was needed. Josiah Mendez from the hardware store was there, and Colette Bauer the dressmaker, who had made Teresa's dress ivory cotton with small pearl buttons, and a collar of fine lace that she had done entirely at her own insistence, at no charge, as a gift for the woman who had organized her finances into comprehensibility. Two of Nathan's ranch hands, a quiet young man named Daniel Webb and an older man called Pete Sorensen, who had been with Nathan for 7 years, stood near the back of the church in their best shirts. Teresa walked to the front of that church in Colette's ivory dress with her mother's hand on her arm and the silver and turquoise ring waiting on the altar table, and she looked at Nathan Sheridan standing there in a dark coat that he had clearly pressed with considerable care, and the look on his face when he saw her was one that she thought she would carry in her chest for the rest of her life. He had said he was not good with words, but his face said everything. The minister, a kind and slightly long-winded man named Reverend Cole, conducted the ceremony with both warmth and a tendency toward lengthy scriptural illustration that Nathan bore with visible patience and Teresa bore with the organizational instinct to note mentally how much of it was actually necessary. But when it came to the vows themselves, simple, traditional, the oldest possible language for the oldest possible intention, Teresa found that she meant every single word with a directness and certainty she had not expected to feel, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death. She had said these words before. They had felt then like a formal commitment, sincere but abstract, a structure she was stepping inside. Now they felt like a description of something already true. When Reverend Cole said Nathan might kiss his bride and Nathan took her face in both hands again, careful, as always, and kissed her in front of their assembled people, Teresa kissed him back with her eyes closed and her hands on his coat, and she thought, there it is, the honest center of things. The celebration afterward was at Nathan's ranch, which had been decorated for the occasion by the combined energies of Margaret, Clara, and Rose Callahan, in a way that was festive and slightly overwhelming. There was food from half a dozen contributions, and the bottle of wine from Nathan's pantry had been joined by several others, and Frank played the fiddle with more enthusiasm than technical precision, and Pete Sorensen turned out to have a genuinely lovely baritone singing voice that no one had been aware of. Late in the evening, when the celebration had reached the comfortable, golden, slightly sleepy stage, Teresa found herself on the porch with Nathan's arm around her and his mother Eleanor standing nearby. Eleanor Sheridan was a small, fine-boned woman who had the same quality of stillness her son had, the same careful gray-green eyes. She had been warm and gracious all day in a contained, considered way, and she had watched Teresa throughout with the particular attention of someone who is trying to form an accurate picture. She came to the porch railing and looked out at the ranch in the autumn dark and said to both of them, "Nathan, your father would have liked her very much." Nathan said, very quietly, "I know." Eleanor looked at Teresa. He was a man who understood that the important thing about land was not owning it. It was what you chose to grow on it. She looked back out at the dark spread of the ranch. "I think the two of you will grow something worth seeing." Teresa, who had spent the better part of a year learning not to need anyone's approval and had largely succeeded, found that this particular approval landed somewhere warm and irreversible. "Thank you," she said. "That means a great deal." Alina nodded once precisely and went back inside to join the rest of the celebration, and Nathan pressed a kiss to Teresa's temple in the dark. The first winter of their marriage was a full and working one. Teresa moved the last of her belongings from the parcel into the main ranch house in November, and they went to the parcel together and did what needed doing to prepare it for the season. The garden beds turned and covered, the coop winterized, the house closed properly against the cold. Agnes the goat relocated to the barn at the main ranch, where she established an immediate and confident social hierarchy over Nathan's existing livestock. They settled into the particular, complicated, daily work of sharing a life with another person, with an ease that was not without its frictions, but was grounded, always, in the habit of honesty they had each brought to every exchange since the beginning. There were differences of opinion about ranch management, about household finances, about how much of Teresa's bookkeeping income should be reinvested in the ranch versus set aside for contingency. All of which they resolved through the same direct, patient negotiation that had characterized everything between them, without theatrics and without erosion. Nathan turned out to be, as a husband, more tender than his particular brand of contained competence had suggested he would be. He was attentive in small, consistent ways that Teresa found more meaningful than large gestures. The way he noticed when she was tired before she said so. The way he always left the morning coffee ready because she was slower to wake than he was. The way he asked, genuinely, about her work every day as though the accounts of Josiah Mendez and Colette Bauer were matters of ongoing interest to him. She reciprocated in the ways that were natural to her, managing their combined finances with the thoroughness and accuracy that meant they always knew exactly where they stood, learning the rhythms of the ranch with a determination that eventually produced a genuine competence with cattle management that surprised Nathan and delighted her. In the evenings they read together, his history and her occasional novel, and talked about what they had read with the ease of people who have discovered they think in compatible ways, which is not the same as thinking alike and is considerably more interesting. Teresa wrote to her mother every 2 weeks and received responses of equal or greater length. She made the ride into town on Thursdays for the market stand and for her bookkeeping clients, which she had expanded by spring to include 3 additional businesses. She knew everyone in Abilene by name within 6 months of her wedding, and they knew her as Nathan Sheridan's wife, who kept half the town's books and grew the best tomatoes in the county, and had an opinion about everything that was worth listening to even when it was inconvenient. Spring came again, and with it the news, confirmed in March of 1883, that they were expecting a child. Nathan received this information in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with an expression that moved through several stages: surprise, a deep and obvious joy, a careful concern for her that he expressed as a series of practical questions about what she needed and whether she was feeling well, before settling into the luminous smile that she had been collecting since the evening by the chicken coop. "Good," he said finally, when he had worked through the practical questions, and he held her in the kitchen in the morning light for a long, quiet moment. "Good," she agreed. She wrote to Rose Callahan in Cincinnati, and the reply was a letter of spectacular emotional intensity that Teresa read aloud to Nathan at supper, which made him laugh more than was strictly polite. Rose came to Abilene that summer, arriving in June and declaring her intention to stay through the birth, which Nathan welcomed with genuine warmth, and which Teresa welcomed with somewhat more complex emotions that she organized into gratitude and managed accordingly. The summer was warm and productive. The parcel east of the creek, which Nathan and Teresa had begun to work together in a more organized capacity rotating crops, expanding the kitchen garden into a proper market garden, adding 2 more hens and a second goat of Agnes's acquaintance named Beatrice, was yielding better than ever. Teresa continued her bookkeeping through the summer from the ranch, and Rose Callahan made herself immediately useful in the kitchen and the garden, and in the ongoing civic life of Abilene, which she found entirely to her taste. Eleanor Sheridan came for 2 weeks in July, and she and Rose established a mutual regard that was, Teresa observed, possibly the 2 most organized and capable elderly women in the state of Kansas, quietly and efficiently running the household between them while she and Nathan were occupied with the ranch and the approaching winter preparations. "I think our mothers are running the ranch," Nathan said one evening. "They are running everything," Teresa agreed. "I am choosing to view it as helpful." "They made a list," he said, "of improvements they think we should make to the kitchen." "The list is accurate," she said. He looked at her. "I have my own list," she admitted. "The layout of the kitchen is inefficient. Your mother and mine have independently arrived at the same conclusion, which suggests it is objectively correct and not merely my preference." He laughed. "Should I just stay out of this entirely?" "Yes," she said. "Absolutely." The baby was born in November of 1883 on a cold, clear night when the stars over the Kansas prairie were brilliant and uncompromising in the dark. Rose Callahan was there, and Margaret, and a competent and experienced midwife named Mrs. Hartley, who had attended more than 300 births in the territory and managed the whole business with a reassuring professional calm. Nathan spent the labor in the kitchen making coffee that no one wanted and then sitting very still in the hallway waiting, which was, for a man accustomed to working steadily through difficulties, clearly the hardest thing he had ever done. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and large and immediately outraged about the world, which he expressed at volume. Nathan was brought in after Mrs. Hartley had attended to everything that needed attending to, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in Teresa's arms with an expression that undid her entirely. It was the most open and unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. He held out one finger and the baby grabbed it with the fierce, reflexive grip of the newborn, and Nathan looked at his son and then at his wife and said, with the exact simple precision of everything he said, "Thank you. You were with me for the hard part," she said, "whether you were in the kitchen or not." He touched her face with his free hand, carefully, the way he had always touched her, and she leaned into it in the way that was by now entirely natural. They named the boy James William Sheridan. James for Nathan's brother-in-law, who had been a steady and kind presence since the wedding. William for Teresa's father, who had died when she was 12 and whose gentleness she still remembered. Rose Callahan stayed through Christmas and then, to everyone's surprise including probably her own, announced that she had decided to settle in Abilene. "You live in Cincinnati," Teresa said, when her mother made this announcement at the supper table in January of 1884. "I lived in Cincinnati," Rose said. "I had a small house and a neighbor I was fond of and a life that was perfectly adequate. But adequate is what you have when you have nothing pulling you anywhere else." She looked at Teresa, and then at Nathan, and then at the baby asleep in his cradle by the warm stove. "I have something pulling me somewhere else." Nathan looked at Teresa. Teresa looked at her mother. "The parcel east of the creek is vacant," Nathan said thoughtfully. Rose Callahan turned to look at him with her sharp, observant eyes. "The house on it is small," he said, "but it was built solidly. There is a kitchen garden already established and the soil is excellent. The porch has recently been repaired and is entirely level." "Nathan," Teresa said. "The creek is worth seeing in spring when the water runs high," he continued, with a straight face. "And the position gives an excellent prospect of the sunrise, which is something, in my experience, worth having." Rose Callahan looked at her daughter. Teresa covered her face with her hand. Then she put her hand down and said, "It is a very good piece of land, Mother." Rose said to Nathan, "Are you offering to rent it to me?" "I'm offering to let you borrow it," he said, "for as long as you would like it, which is what I offered Teresa, and I think the terms worked out well enough." Rose Callahan was quiet for a moment. Nathan held her gaze with complete composure. "I accept," she said. So Rose Callahan came to live on the parcel east of the creek in the spring of 1884, and Agnes the goat, who had by now established herself as a permanent and sovereign presence on the Sheridan Ranch, made her opinion of this development known by visiting the parcel regularly and eating Rose's hat on the third day, which Rose took with remarkable good humor. The life they built in those years had the quality of something constructed with proper materials and good light. Nathan's ranch grew steadily, not dramatically, not in the fast, speculative way of men who were chasing the last big push of the cattle era, but in the patient, calibrated way of someone who understood that the land was not infinite and the work was not temporary. By 1886, they ran 400 head of cattle and had added a proper granary and a second bunkhouse, and Nathan had taken on 2 additional hands and was teaching Daniel Webb, the quiet young man from the original crew, the full scope of ranch management, with the deliberate intention of giving Webb a stake in the operation within a few years. Teresa's bookkeeping practice had grown into something that the town of Abilene depended on, and she had by that year taken on a young woman named Sarah Bright. As an assistant, Sarah was 19 and quick, with numbers and hungry to learn, and Teresa taught her with the directness and patience she had received from no one but which she had decided to give freely. In the spring of 1885, their second child was born, a girl they named Elena Rose, for both grandmothers, who received this news with a satisfaction so complete and mutual that it further cemented an alliance between them that was, at that point, one of the defining features of the extended Sheridan family landscape. Elena Rose was born with Nathan's gray-green eyes and Teresa's determination, a combination that Nathan observed would probably reshape the state of Kansas if left unchecked. James William, who was by then a large-footed, perpetually dirty, good-natured boy of a year and a half, received his sister with the tolerant curiosity of a very young person confronted with something smaller than himself. Margaret and Frank had 2 children of their own by then, a boy and a girl, and the cousins grew up in and out of each other's houses with the easy familiarity of children who understand that family is expansive. Frank continued to work the cattle yards and continued to argue cheerfully with Nathan about land management, and continued to be the person who cried at every important occasion, which was one of the things Teresa had come to be deeply fond of about him. Colette Bauer made Elena Rose's first proper dress, as she had made Teresa's wedding dress, as a gift, and declared it to be some of her finest work. Josiah Mendez at the hardware store, whose books Teresa had been keeping for 3 years by this point, told everyone who came into his store that Teresa Sheridan was the reason he was still in business, which was a slight exaggeration but not by much. In the summer of 1886, Nathan and Teresa rode out one warm evening to the stretch of cottonwoods along the high-water bank, the place he had taken her in that first spring when she had been learning to disagree with herself about what she was built for. They left the horses at the bank and walked under the cottonwoods in the long light, and it was so similar to that first time that Teresa felt it as a kind of echo, the same water, the same light through the same leaves, the same man beside her, and entirely different, because everything had happened in between. "Do you remember what you told me," she said, "about the river being the honest part of the land?" "My father's theory," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 4 years," she said. "I think he was right, and I think you are the same kind of thing, the honest part." He looked at her in the summer light. "Of my life," she said, "the part that just goes where it needs to go." He was quiet for a moment in the particular way she knew completely by now, the way that meant something real was coming. "You came to me already knowing where you needed to go," he said. "I just happened to have land in that direction." She laughed. Then she stopped laughing and looked at him seriously, because the thing she wanted to say next required seriousness. "I told myself I was not built for starting over," she said. I told myself that with such conviction that I almost believed it completely. Almost, he said. You said I could borrow the land, she said. That was the specific thing, not offered, not given, borrowed, like you understood that what I needed first was just ground to stand on, not someone to stand on it for me. You were always going to be all right, he said. I could see that from the beginning. I just wanted to be nearby while you figured that out. She had been nearby. She had been the coffee on the porch and the chickens, and the goat named Agnes, and the suppers on Thursdays, and the hands careful on her face. She had been 12 years of patient, honest work that made a man who understood both the value of land and the value of letting someone find their own footing on it. She took his hand and they stood by the honest river in the summer evening, and Teresa thought about what it meant to have been wrong about yourself, and to have had the extraordinary luck of being proven wrong by something real. The life they had was not without its difficulties, because nothing real is. There were drought years when the cattle price dropped, and the market garden yielded less, and the accounts were tight and required the kind of careful management that reminded Teresa why she had always been good at arithmetic. There were nights when Alina Rose was ill and Nathan and Teresa took turns through the small hours with the specific terror and weariness of parents helpless against a child's fever. And there were mornings after those nights when the fever had broken, and they sat together in the kitchen in the gray dawn and drank coffee in silence, and the relief was so profound, it needed no words. There was a hard winter in 1887, when a cattle rancher from the Northern Territory attempted to claim water rights on the creek that ran through Nathan's land, citing an old survey error, and Nathan spent 3 months working with a Wichita lawyer, and presenting records and maps and the kind of meticulous documentation that Teresa had been maintaining since before they were married, and which made the case conclusive. The rancher withdrew his claim. Teresa filed the records with considerable satisfaction. In the spring of 1888, their third child was born, another boy, smaller than James had been but equally vocal. They named him Thomas Frank, the second name for Frank Caldwell, who cried with his customary thoroughness upon learning this. Thomas Frank Sheridan was from the first a different kind of child than his older siblings, quieter, more observant, with Teresa's mother's sharp eyes and a patience that reminded everyone of Nathan at his most still. Rose Callahan, who by 1888 had been at the parcel east of the creek for 4 years and was by all measures one of the most established presences in the community east of Abilene, welcomed her third grandchild with practical competence and emotional abundance, and immediately began teaching James William, who was 4.5 and deeply impressed by his own standing as the eldest, how to fish in the creek. Alina Sheridan came from Wichita every spring and sometimes in the fall, and the ranch in those seasons had the particular fullness of a house with grandchildren and grandmothers in it simultaneously, which was loud and warm and involved a great deal of food and a complete absence of any logical conversation in the evenings. And Nathan observed it all from the porch with a quiet contentment that Teresa thought was the most beautiful thing about him. By 1889, when the children were 6 and 4 and 1, and the ranch had settled into the comfortable, productive middle years of something well built, Teresa sat at the kitchen table one September evening after the children were asleep, and Nathan was on the porch with the last of the light, and she looked at the household accounts. She had been reviewing and thought about that Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, when the telegram had arrived, and the 12 cold words had told her that everything was gone. She thought about standing on Margaret's porch and telling herself she was not built for starting over. She thought about riding to the parcel east of the creek on Frank's borrowed mare and walking around the leaning house in the spring wind, looking at the dark soil near the creek bank and the outlines of the kitchen garden beds and thinking, with terrified and tentative possibility, but maybe the land is. She thought about Nathan Sheridan mending fence in his rolled-up sleeves, looking up when she rode in, and listening to her proposal with that steady, direct attention and saying, "It's not charity." It's a practical arrangement. She thought about chickens and a goat named Agnes and suppers on Thursday evenings, and a river running high with spring melt, and cottonwood leaves the color of something new. She thought about two hands careful on her face, and a kiss in the evening light that had undone 6 weeks of scrupulous defensive practicality in approximately 3 seconds. She thought about an ivory dress with pearl buttons, and the silver turquoise ring on her finger, and a man in a carefully pressed coat whose face, when he saw her walking toward him, said everything. She thought about James Williams' first ungainly steps across the kitchen floor, Thomas Frank's particular and serious expression at 2 months old, Alina Rose's gray-green eyes looking up at her from the cradle with the comprehensive attention of a person who had already decided she was going to understand everything. She set down the accounts and went out to the porch. Nathan was in his chair, looking out at the evening prairie, and he looked up when she came out and made room for her on the wide arm of the chair as he always did, and she settled against him in the comfortable, easy way of long practice. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The telegram," she said. He was quiet. "I used to think about it and feel the bottom fall out of things," she said. "Tonight I was thinking about it and I felt grateful for the telegram, which seems—" "No," he said. "It doesn't seem strange." "It's strange," she said. "Maybe," he said. He put his arm around her. "Or maybe it's just accurate about where it led." She looked at the September prairie turning dark and golden in the last of the light. Somewhere out there to the east was the creek and the parcel, and the small house with the level porch where her mother's lamp was lit. Somewhere in the house behind them 3 children were asleep in the particular unconscious completeness of children who have never had reason to doubt that the world is steady. "Nathan," she said. "I think I was wrong," she said, "about not being built for starting over." He was quiet for a moment in his thinking way. "I know you were," he said. "You have rebuilt yourself from the ground up twice in the time I have known you, once before I met you and once starting from that parcel. And both times it was better than before." She thought about this. "You're going to make me argue with you about whether that's 3 times or 2. How is it 3? "Because I rebuilt myself falling in love with you," she said, which was its own separate construction project and required considerable structural renovation. He laughed, the real one, not the quiet one, the one she had been working for from the beginning and collecting ever since. "I'm going to take that as a compliment." "It was the most thorough compliment I have ever paid," she said. He held her in the September dusk and the prairie breathed around them, enormous and old and indifferent to everyone's troubles and beautiful in its indifference, and Teresa thought, "This is what I am built for, this specific and ordinary and extraordinary life. This man, these children, this land." She had been wrong, and being wrong had led her here, which meant that being wrong had been, in some deeply impractical and entirely real sense, the best thing that had ever happened to her. The stars came out over Kansas one at a time, the way they always did, slowly, and then all at once, and they sat on the porch until the night was full of them and then went inside to their life. Years later, when Alina Rose was grown and James William had taken a proper stake in the ranch alongside Daniel Webb, who had done exactly what Nathan had planned for him, and had become, over the decade of his tenure, both a skilled manager and a genuine friend to the family. And Thomas Frank had proved himself the most remarkable reader in the family, and was studying law in Wichita with the earnest intensity of a young man who has found his exact right purpose. Teresa would sometimes find herself walking the parcel east of the creek in the early morning. Rose Callahan was still there, considerably older now but undimmed, tending her garden with the focused energy of a woman who had found, in her 60s, what she was supposed to be doing. Agnes the goat had died of old age in 1891 and been succeeded by a sequence of goats who all carried the spirit of Agnes in various degrees of inconvenience and magnificence. The creek ran as it always had, honest and unmanageable, going where it needed to go. Teresa would walk the creek bank in the early morning, And think about the woman who had stood here in 1882 with the spring wind in her hair and told herself she was not capable of this. She felt a tenderness toward that woman, the kind of tenderness you feel towards someone who was doing their very best with what they had and simply hadn't yet discovered what they were made of. Nathan would find her there sometimes, on his morning ride through the south fence line, and he would dismount and tie the horse and walk to where she was, and they would stand together by the water in the early light, older now, deeper in each other in the way that years of honest living make you deep in someone and not say very much, because there was nothing that needed to be said that hadn't already been lived. The land knew them by now. The creek knew them. The deep-rooted prairie grass and the cottonwood leaves and the long Kansas sky that arched over everything with its particular enormous grace. All of it knew the shape of the life that had been built here, steadily and honestly and with both hands. It had not been borrowed land for a very long time. It was simply theirs, worked and known and loved in the thorough, unglamorous, extraordinary way that the best things in a life are loved. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with the full attention of two people who had both, in their different ways and from their different losses, learned that paying attention was the only thing that made anything real. Teresa stood by the creek in the morning light and listened to the water run over the limestone and felt the solid, familiar presence of Nathan beside her and thought, I am here. I built this. We built this. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.